Welcome to Desert Wanderers, produced by Salt and Light Radio. If you're new here, we bridge the gap between you and the person in the pew next to you. I will be interviewing priests, religious, and laity in our local Boise diocese, asking questions that'll help you navigate your vocation and help build community wherever you are with whatever resources you may have. Let's build the city of God together. Well, Father Vance, how are you this morning?
I'm fine, Natalie. I'm doing fine. Thank you.
This podcast has taken a lot of work.
Yeah.
You and I have had to do a lot of things to get this working for the viewers. We ended up having, the first time you met with me, the audio, my little recording device broke. So that was great. And we couldn't find the backup. And then we found the backup. And then literally all my equipment was working. And 3 minutes before you came in, my camera broke. So
and the topic is not exorcism for once, right? For once in my life, the topic is not exorcism. So
and we're having so many issues. I'm just like, okay, what's going on here? I feel like that almost solidifies your point, which we'll get to in a second, we're talking today about the Lord of the Rings new series. The
Rings of Power.
The Rings
Amazon.
of Power.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So, just as a heads up. But it's like, you're right, it's not an exorcist. And we've had so much trouble, filming this, that it's been like, okay, what's going on
Well,
here?
we're here. We're here now. Yep.
We're here now.
That's the point, right?
Yes. So, today, like we said just a second ago, we're going to be talking about Rings of Power. Can you just go into a little bit of your background in Tolkien?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, Tolkien and his mythology are a primary source of meaning for me and symbolism for me and even spirituality for me. I first encountered Tolkien as, I think, a 7th or an 8th grader. My mom was in a book club that read The Hobbit, and she thought my weird son with his brain going everywhere, would probably enjoy this. So she gave me that, and ever since then I've been hooked. And, for a long time in my life, I read every piece of heroic fantasy I could get my hands on, and we can talk about some of those other authors if you want to, but I always came back to Tolkien. And then I read the Lord of the Rings every summer for probably 17 years or so. And things changed for me significantly when I was in Australia in 2003, and I was doing what Jesuits call tertianship, which is the last official stage of our formation process. Mm-hmm. And during that time, we make the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius Loyola. Okay. And for the second time. So the first time we make it is in the novitiate when we're novices. I made it over its 9-month format once in my life too, but then I went to tertianship and made the 30-day silent retreat for the second time in my life. And during that silent retreat, I decided that I would read The Lord of the Rings. And I mentioned that to my spiritual director, and he was absolutely opposed to that.
What?
And I disobeyed him.
Oh, no!
And read them anyway. And that experience kind of sank the meaning of Tolkien to a far deeper level for me. Yeah. And ever since then, I've been interested in Tolkien's Catholicism, in Tolkien's spirituality, in how that comes through, not in an allegorical way, that's an important distinction to make, but how it comes through his writings. And of course, now I teach at Bishop Kelly, I teach a senior seminar in the Catholic theology of J.R.R. Tolkien. And our central text, I want that to be a class where students can come and they can learn theology, even if they don't know The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings, because the primary text for that class is the Silmarillion. Yes. So his kind of masterwork that wasn't published until after his death. Yeah. I'm not sure he expected it to ever be published. I think it was something kind of almost private for him, because he started writing the tales that wound their way into the Silmarillion in the trenches of the Somme battlefield in World War I. So, and then you surround yourself with a group of people who are also Tolkien scholars, and I've watched as Catholic scholarship of Tolkien has, when I first encountered Tolkien, it was non-existent, and now it's very accepted in scholarly circles. So.
That is really interesting to me, because I feel like, I don't know if it's because I read it as an adult. So I only started reading the trilogy like 3 years ago, right?
For the first time.
For the first time, which is actually, I read the Lord of the Rings, the Hobbit, and then the trilogy, and then I also read C.S. Lewis's The Chronicles of Narnia, which actually starts, like, believe it or not, it actually starts with the magician's uncle,
right,
which is a good book too.
The guy who's the old professor in Lion, Witch, and Wardrobe is the young guy in the very first book of this series.
Yeah. So, anyways, like, I think those books are wasted on children. I just, when you read them as an adult, I think sometimes I'm actually really glad I didn't have the interest to read them as a child, because when I read them as an adult, there was so much more in my I was more mature in my faith. So there was so much more fruit that came out of those stories.
Do you know the story? And this is maybe off topic, but I'm an English teacher, so one of my degrees from Gonzaga University is in literature, and so I'm an English teacher by training, and I teach theology kind of by necessity because of the shirt I wear. But but my love is for literature. That's my love. And do you know the story of Harper Lee and the sequel to Kill a Mockingbird?
No, I don't.
Yeah, so it was published a number of years ago, probably 5-6 years ago, and it's called To Set a Watchman. I think that's the title of the book, and it's a sequel to Kill a Mockingbird. Oh. And when it came out, people were really kind of pillaring it as being so different. I mean, To Kill a Mockingbird is so iconic with Atticus, and he's such a father figure and such a moral character. And Go Set a Watchman, that's the title of the book. Go Set a Watchman is about Scout as an adult. And she has changed her view of her father. And it's not as romanticized and it's not as childlike. And so I think of that because of what you just said about the Chronicles of Narnia. I mean, I think Chronicles of Narnia, they'll give to kids what they give to kids, and then they'll give to adults what they give to adults. And one of the things that Lewis was such a master at is making his writings applicable to both, to both children and adults.
I think that's the same with A.A. Mills. Like, I love...
Yeah, I agree. I think that's the same with kind of mythology, folktale in general. I mean, it's the same. It's the same with Grimm, with the Brothers Grimm. Yeah. And there's a famous book by child psychologist Bruno Bettelheim called The Uses of Enchantment, which talks about fairy tales as vicarious experiences of maturation, where children don't have to expose themselves to mortal danger in order to learn the lessons that'll help them grow into adults.
Okay, so my husband spent some time, this is kind of off topic, but I'm going to go there anyways. My husband spent some time in Austria when he was learning German, and he said that they have this like tradition during Christmas, like called, what do they call it? It's called Christminster, I think, or something.
Oh, is it Krampus?
Krampus, that's what it is. Yeah. And I'm like, I was a scared child. I was afraid of everything. Can you imagine?
Even Santa Claus coming down your chimney was scary for you, right? Yeah.
Well, I mean, I actually didn't think about it like that, but it would have been had I thought about it as a... I was just such a, like, fearful child. Can you imagine? So for anyone that doesn't know, what I was explained from my husband yesterday was that they have this tradition of this, like, guy that's like a goat, like kind of like a figure, like, what's the guy in Narnia?
The faun.
The faun, right? Kind of like that guy, but evil.
Yeah.
Who steals children.
Yeah.
If they're bad.
Yeah.
And I'm like...
He's like Santa Claus's evil twin.
Yes, and it's like the anti-Santa or whatever. It's so scary, and I'm like, how could kids like be okay with it? But it's kind of the same story, right? Where they have this story that will teach them these moral values without like having to put them in danger.
And it's one of those things where the original, the source material for what we now think of as Santa Claus is so much richer. And I mean, we've just completely cheapened Santa Claus and his significance, right? I lived for a while before I came to Boise. I lived for a while in North Pole, Alaska.
Oh my gosh!
I was there for 2 years. I was helping out at a small Jesuit, or a small high school up there, a Catholic high school, and of course the parish in North Pole, Alaska, is named St. Nicholas. Yeah. Right? And I was asked to preside at the children's mass on Christmas Eve, and they told me what was going to happen. I thought it was the corniest, stupidest thing I'd ever heard until I saw it. Because at the children's mass on Christmas Eve, Santa Claus is the last person to receive communion. And he doesn't look at anybody. He comes up with his hat in his hand. He's very, very reverent. and he receives communion. Then he goes over to the crest and he gets down on both knees and says a prayer and crosses himself and leaves. And the kids are amazing. They're like, and North Pole is not on the geographic North Pole.
Yeah.
It's south of Fairbanks, but it's the place where all the letters come.
Oh
I mean,
my
that's
gosh,
part of their
yeah.
industry in North Pole, is to answer all these letters to Santa Claus at North Pole.
Oh my gosh! So
Yeah.
wait, people actually answer if
Yeah.
you die? Oh my gosh!
It's one of the town cottage industries is to answer the letters that all the kids send to Santa.
Yeah, if you have kids, please turn this off and mute this.
Yeah.
You know what? So I had an interview a couple weeks ago with Teresa Zapeta. She and I talked about how she didn't have to lie to her kids because she made like the Feast of St. Nicholas so real, and they knew the saint that they weren't like, she was saying that her kids didn't ever believe that he was some like magical person. They knew he was a saint, and if God was going to give him the graces to come and give presents to everyone, then they could. But it's like still, it was like knowing that God gave the grace to the saint and gave him the power.
It's a beautiful story of St. Nicholas's life that we have translated into the hanging of stockings, right?
Yeah.
And we're off topic now.
I know.
But it's
we're going to go with the flow.
yeah, but it's okay. But one of the interests of mine, both scholarly and theologically, is the origins of these secularized celebrations like Halloween and Easter and Christmas and all this stuff, and kind of the Christian and Catholic mythological underpinnings of them.
Well, I really like the one I got really excited about. I listened to this series with my kids called Saints Alive. It's a podcast, and it's really good. There's like, it's like kind of like Adventures in Odyssey, but for children, but about saints. And one of the ones they had was Saint Valentine, and I thought, how cool is it? Out of all of the traditions that we have in the U.S. that are very secularized, that's the only one. I mean, sure, it's a little overboard, but it's the only one that's fairly accurate about giving the like card
from your Valentine
that has a gift, and like for her to receive the miracle of, I believe it was sight, right? Yeah, so for her to receive that, it was just beautiful. But it's honestly one of the closest ones we have. I think even if you think of what's the other one that a lot of people... So I guess there's St. Nick, like we said, with the stockings. So you can kind of see the stockings and how that parallels. But it's also been like very commercialized and everything.
There's a folktale legend about why we hide Easter eggs that comes directly from the crucifixion and the resurrection and stuff. So, I mean, it's everywhere. That's, our secularized and atheistic culture and society will always consciously try to downplay or minimize the religious significance. However, you can't downplay it because it's there. It's there. That's why these things started.
I think that's the cool thing about being Catholic, though, because once we get into these stories and once we learn the origins and once we're involved in it more, then it's like, wow, this like secular holiday we can actually celebrate in a like more beautiful and a more intentional way.
Exactly.
And it doesn't like take away from that holiday, but it actually enriches it.
Exactly.
Like I said, with Teresa, we had a discussion on having a spiritual Advent, and I was so excited. I came so engaged and excited to come back out of that conversation, because I felt like for the first time in my like Catholic faith did I really feel like I knew enough and could practice Advent without celebrating Christmas, which is really cool.
Yeah, exactly.
So I'm excited for that. But I want to
the same lesson will apply to Lent too, to be in Lent before Easter and to make Lent its own kind of spiritual season before the season of Easter.
Yeah, absolutely. I almost feel like it's easier because Lent is always known to be like this time of like penance and fasting. And Advent is, although I don't think it's ever, up until recent years, I hadn't really heard of it as like a penitential season, which is kind of what it is. It's a
same
fasting.
liturgical color as Lent.
Yeah.
Purple.
Right.
Yeah.
So I want to get back to something that we talked about earlier, and I think this ties in with the Rings of Power, but we're going to talk about stories, and I wanted to get your opinion on why it seemed like we have, C.S. Lewis, we have Tolkien, and I know it's not the same, but A.A. Mills with Winnie the Pooh is so good, but like, what do you think it is about those storytellers? Do you think, I guess my question comes to, is it a time period thing? Or is it just a type of storytelling that they do?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the answer is not a black and white answer, right? And which Rarely
Yeah,
is.
right.
So when you talk about mythologists, one of the goals of my course is that students understand that mythology is a cheapened word today. To say something is a myth just means it's not true. That's what we mean when we say myth. But myth for cultures previous to us and time periods previous to us is a very rich idea about the kind of stories that are that communicate truths that are always applicable in our lives, right? And so let's from that perspective, let's look at some of the Bible, right? So I gave a talk on exorcism at Bishop Kelly a few weeks ago for parents, and just about my experience and my training and my work in that ministry. And at the end of the talk, a mom of students came up and she said, "Do you know what some of your theology teachers are teaching my children?" And I thought, "Oh boy, here we go." And I said, "No, tell me." And she said, "They're teaching my children that Adam and Eve were not real people." And I said, "Well, they probably weren't." Right? And so that's what I mean by mythological. So to say that Adam and Eve weren't real people isn't to cheapen the truth of the Adam and Eve story. It's to recognize that Adam and Eve reflect that God is the creative intention behind everything that is, right? And is the ongoing creative intention behind everything that grows. And also to tell a story about how evil entered human experience, right? And so I asked her, I said, "Do you agree that when Genesis, the creation account in Genesis says that God created the world in 7 days, that does not refer to 7 24-hour time periods?" And she said, "Yeah, I agree with that." And I said, "Then how can Adam and Eve, I mean, if Adam and Eve were real people, they had Cain and Abel, Cain killed Abel, where did everybody else come from?"
Right. Exactly.
Right.
Yeah.
So, I'm not questioning the veracity. I mean, the Catholic Church teaches that the truths contained in the Scripture are necessary, are the ones that are necessary for our salvation. Right. And so I'm not questioning that. But I'm saying that the Bible is not one book. It's a library. It has a poetry section in it. It has a current events section in it. And it has a myth section in it too. So that's all background to the question that you asked,
Right.
So I think that the human condition responds to that kind of mythology, to that mythology, defined that way. And I think that sometimes we respond to it on the shallow end of the pool, and sometimes we respond to it on the deep end of the pool.
Yeah.
And one of the things that, this is a few years ago now, but I got a lot of questions about how is Tolkien substantively different from Game of Thrones. You remember Game of Thrones?
Yes. I'm glad you brought that up. I'm really glad you brought that up, because one of the things that I was thinking about, and I guess I probably am more on the surface with these kinds of things, just because, like, when someone explains or, like, talks through a piece of Tolkien, I'm like, wow, that's so deep. And, like, I see it and it's beautiful. And there's little things that I'll pick up, and I think I'm getting better the more and more I read these types of mythologies. But one of the things I liked about Tolkien, and the one thing I liked about Game of Thrones, although I haven't read the books, so it's a shame on me for watching those awful movies.
Yeah.
But anyways, is that the reason that I was so captured by it was because how many different stories were going on at once,
right.
and how many different perspectives. But as you were talking, I was just thinking, maybe that's not true, like, true good in the myth. Maybe that's just playing on our short attention spans.
That's not mythology. I agree. And even if you do read the books, one of the things that characterizes Game of Thrones books is the short chapters, and every chapter is from a different character's perspective.
Yeah.
And so I think that Game of Thrones, I think it's a great ripping yarn. It's not ethical, and it's not moral, it's not theological, and it's not spiritual.
I think that it's
entertaining.
That's what I was going to say. I think the reason people like it is because it's not any of those things, that it's like this debauchery almost.
Yeah, but for Tolkien and for Lewis, the ultimate purpose of story, and we're not just talking about stories as the plural forms of literature, we're talking about story with a capital S, the great story of creation and redemption, right? The story. The purpose of story is to ennoble.
Yes.
And to help humanity rise above its pettiness in this world. Things like Game of Thrones, it appeals to the narrative need for heroic fantasy. It also appeals to the more purient kind of parts of our, because
Yeah.
I mean it's so immoral. And
Yeah.
Tolkien and Lewis, like I said, are always seeking with their stories to ennoble, and
Yeah.
that just, I mean, it fits in with the church's mission.
Well, my favorite character, which I don't think is very debated, is Samwise Gamgee.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, he's obviously the main character in the story, and it's so funny because you don't realize that until the end.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah. But let's go ahead. Let's go on and talk about, because I think this is one of the points I wanted to bring up about the Rings of Power.
Mm-hmm.
So I've been reflecting on this because, spoiler alert, I liked them. The first season I was kind of iffy about. The second season I actually liked, but I also just took it as what it was. I wasn't trying to like get into it as like a Tolkien work, but I did take it as what it was. I enjoyed it. But the one thing I was going to say is, I think, again, the reason I enjoyed it was because it was like, there's all of these different characters, and they have all of their different problems that are going on at the same time, and we're just going through each one, and it's this character change. Mm-hmm. And so I think the more I reflect on it, I think that's really the reason that I liked it, is because the entertaining of like, ooh, what's going on with that character now, and what's going on with this character, and what's going on, here and there, and it's more like playing on my like small, my small attention span than it is having like a really great story. So I guess, what would you say when we're talking about the Rings of Power? Do you think that that's fairly accurate on why someone might like it or someone might enjoy it?
So a number of weeks ago, we talked about the fact that this might turn into a fight, right? Because, and a respectful fight, but no, I don't think that. And I mean, once again, from the 33,000 foot level, my objection to Rings of Power, and if you're just a passive consumer of YouTube, I mean, people are just so against it, right? And one of the wings of criticism that I've listened to is the woke stuff, right? Mm-hmm. And I mean, that doesn't, okay. I mean, I would consider myself anti-woke and fairly conservative in my politics and all that stuff. Yeah. But at the same time, that I'm okay with a black elf. I'm okay with the different cultures represented, even though it's not a faithful representative of the canon. So Tolkien's mythology takes place in a mythical time of Northern Europe. And there weren't a lot of brown-skinned people in Northern Europe in medieval times. But okay, so our world has changed, and I get that. That's fine. That's fine with me. My problem with the Rings of Power is that, and we may have talked about this too, there was lots of stories about what Amazon had the rights to. Right. And they don't have the rights, or they didn't have the rights to some of the central stories of the Silmarillion. And I don't know if that means that somebody else is planning on developing those properties for movies or not. But they had rights to some of the appendices and some of the peripheral stories from the Silmarillion, right? And but my problem is that they incorporated canonical characters like Galadriel, first of all, into those peripheral stories. And what they did was they changed her. They changed the character. And this happens all the time with literature that I love. It happens with Shakespeare. It happens with all kinds of literature. It even happened with, if you remember, what's the Mockingjay, the Hunger Games? The Hunger Games. It happened with that too. So when a movie comes out that's based on a book, the movie's visuals plant themselves in your brain easier than a book's visuals plant themselves in your brain, because it's less work. Right? Yeah. And so, my encouragement to people is always, if you have the choice, to read the books first. And the reason I say that is because no matter how good Peter Jackson's portrayal of Aragorn was, I still have an image of Aragorn in my brain that is not Viggo Mortensen, because I read the stories, I read the books before I watched the movies. And you can't go the other way. I know. It's not backwards compatible. There is a generation of people who are now growing up, and because it's not as much of a commitment, and it's not as, it's much easier to watch The Rings of Power than to read the Silmarillion, they're going to grow up thinking that's Galadriel, and that is not Galadriel. That is not the canonical Galadriel. It's not the canonical, some of the other stuff. That's my biggest problem. That's my biggest problem.
And that's fair, because I think that we've talked about this before. The Silmarillion is more of a history, so you're not getting that story, character, person, like kind of visual with that when you read it. It's like reading a history book.
Yeah.
And I think that that's hard when you're saying, if you're trying to stay true to a character, you're going to get, like, I don't know, how do I want to say this, but obviously they're going to embellish a lot of stuff to make her more interesting, or like embellish parts of her life.
Well, I would say even more than they want to make her interesting, they want to make her applicable to what they think the audience wants to see.
I know, which
is unfair, right?
Yeah.
And so, I mean, once again, to harp on Galadriel, Galadriel in the mythology is one of the wisest people in the whole mythology.
Yeah.
Because she's aware of the mistakes that she made earlier in her life, and we don't have time to go into the specifics of that.
I think,
but in Tolkien, in the books, she never picks up. Well, there's an exception to that. She does pick up a sword once earlier in her life, and she pays a price for it for the rest of her life. But by the time of the Lord of the Rings, she is not really a pacifist, but she's wise. She has the wisdom born from her temptations and from her mistakes. That's why the scene, both in the book and in the movies, when Frodo offers her the ring, is such a temptation for her, and why she freaks out so much, and why she says at the end of that, I passed the test. I passed the test. But girl boss Galadriel in the Rings of Power will never get to that place.
I actually like her in season. I think part of the reason I liked season 2 better than season 1 is because of her like, she's still trying to be this warrior, right, that you're saying that she's not, and that, but at the same time, I like that she's humbled a little bit, and I like the ending scene, sorry, spoiler alert if you haven't seen season 2, but the very end, when she wakes up from her, like, trying to get the people out of the town or whatever.
Falling off a cliff.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, that's what it was.
And living.
Well, no, she did live, and then she, like, tried to, like, get out, right? Anyways, so she falls to her death and doesn't die. But at the end, though, I like the scene where she rises and she has no armor on. She's completely stripped of all of these things that she thought that she needed to be, or that she was, like, struggling with. And I don't know if that, like, goes into I just like that she's been a much more humble character than season 1. Yeah. And I think that was enjoyable to watch as a Catholic, not knowing Tolkien.
Yeah, maybe as from its own perspective, maybe.
Right.
I don't agree, because I love the Galadriel of the books.
And that's and that's fair, because she is much different. I mean, think about in the Hobbit. No, sorry, I'm getting them all mixed up. In the second book of the Lord of the Rings and the Two Towers, isn't that when she meets Dwarf, and he's, like, completely in love with her? And he's like, I'm going to fight anyone that says any words against this elf or whatever, Yeah,
so in the Lord of the Rings, it's Gimli.
It's Gimli, yes,
yeah.
Thanks.
And Galadriel gives Gimli 3. He asks her, and he's very humble about it. He said, because she's giving everybody gifts as they leave Lothlorien. And she asks him what a dwarf would ask of an elf. And he says, if you really want me to ask, 1 hair from your head. And she gives him 3, and he encases it in crystal, like a relic,
Yeah.
But yeah, once again, I think the humbling of Galadriel in season 2 of the Rings of Power, to me, is too little, too late. Way too little, too late.
And I think that's fair.
Yeah. My problem is it's $1 billion plus show.
Yeah.
So get it right.
Yeah.
Get it right from the get-go.
Yeah.
Don't make us watch stuff that you later have to pull back from.
Yeah.
So the other part of the rights question was, if they had rights to some of the appendices, they could have just made people up. They could have told good stories that were consistent with the mythological and kind of theological direction of Tolkien, but didn't have to be about Galadriel, and didn't have to be. I feel the same way about this as I feel about the Star Wars universe and the Disney properties, right?
Yeah,
it's like not every Star Wars movie has to be about the Skywalkers. They think it does because they think that's what people want to see, but the universe is big enough to accommodate stories of other people. There's a play, I don't know if you know who Tom Stoppard is. He's a playwright, and one of his famous plays is called Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead. Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are minor characters in Shakespeare's play Hamlet. And in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern become the chief characters, and you've got to know Hamlet in order to get the beauty of it, but all the stuff of Hamlet is going on in the background, and Rosencrantz and Guildenstern are trying to figure out what in the world is going on around them, and it's awesome. It's really, really awesome, and I wish that Rings of Power had done that instead of pretend to be an expert on Tolkien when you're not, and then present something that's not canon as though it were.
Yeah.
And then it makes my job when students come into my class that much harder
Yeah.
to clean that up, to clean that mess up.
That when they slap the name Tolkien on this, people think that it's actually Tolkien.
Yeah, exactly.
And I think that I was at first when you had come to me and I was like, oh, I liked it. And you're like, but it's not Tolkien. And I'm like, well, yeah, of course it's not Tolkien. Like, you know, I was like, because you can read the other books and without knowing the Silmarillion, you could be like this wouldn't fly with Tolkien. Like the orcs having babies, like we talked about that before.
Talked about that before.
That is so ridiculous. And that just doesn't come out with
and let me give you another example from Peter Jackson's Hobbit trilogy of something that he included that is not Tolkien, but is absolutely in line with the mythology of Tolkien.
Okay.
I don't know if we talked about this before, but that's an interesting story too. I mean, you know, Guillermo del Toro was supposed to direct those movies, and because pre-production was taking so long, he had other commitments, so he had to back out of the project. And I think the studio and the fans all wanted to see Peter Jackson get back into the universe, right? But he didn't have the time that he had with Lord of the Rings for pre-production and for thinking. And
we're talking about the Hobbit movies.
We're talking about the Hobbit movies now, and so he got under a lot of pressure, and I think the movies suffered for that. One of the characters that he introduced in the Hobbit movie that appears nowhere in Tolkien is that elf Tauriel, who falls in love with Fili or Kili, I think, one of the dwarves, right? And at the end of the movie, the dwarf dies. The dwarf dies in the battle, and she comes out to mourn his body. And her king, Thranduil, who happens to be Legolas's father, comes out, and she looks at him and she says, she's kneeling over the dwarf's body, and it's the love story is stupid, it's idiotic, but this is absolutely beautiful. And she looks at her king and she says, if this is love, I want no part of it. She says, why does it hurt so much? And he looks at her, and once again, this line does not occur in anything Tolkien wrote. He said, it hurts so much because it was real. Which is absolutely consistent with the mythological kind of direction of Tolkien, right? And also the Christian conception of love, you know, based on the sacrifice of Jesus, right? Love will hurt, but it's worth it. It's worth the hurt. I mean, I always say when people mourn, and these funerals I've got ahead of me will probably have to say that message, is that would you rather have not loved the person and not have to mourn their passing? Or would you take the mourning if you have the love too? And everybody will say the latter. Even if I have to hurt, I'd rather have the love. And that's how God made us, right? And so I've not seen anything in 2 seasons of Rings of Power that even approach that kind of depth.
I agree.
And Peter Jackson, even when it's quote unquote not Tolkien, there's no that's not canon. Tauriel and that love story is not canon, but that statement is absolutely consistent with the theological message of all of Tolkien's mythology.
I think the one thing that I picked up from Tolkien the most is the idea of, like, when we think of Christ, is this sacrificial love, right? And at every point, every character has to have a choice between, am I going to do the right thing and sacrifice myself or this situation for the good of the other? And you can think about, I know that we're supposed to be talking about Rings of Power, but we could go back to Boromir. When he is tempted with the ring, again, it's this point where he should be choosing sacrificial love, but he falls short. And that shows our humanity, I think.
And he atones. He atones with his life. He atones with his life. And the biggest failure, quote unquote failure, is Frodo. Frodo can't do it when it comes to it, right? And it's only God. Now that's an important mythological and theological lesson in Tolkien too, because it's Gollum who bites Frodo's finger off and then slips off the edge. That enables the quest to be fulfilled. However, Gollum had lots of opportunities to lose his life. Way back in The Hobbit, Bilbo has the ring on. He realizes that it makes him invisible, and he's in front of Gollum, and Gollum is literally between him and where he wants to get, and he's thinking, maybe I should kill him. And then what Bilbo feels, Tolkien calls pity. And pity is a theological word in Tolkien, and pity is also related to the word piety. I mean, Tolkien was a linguist, so there's no accident that he would use these words that are linguistically related to one another. And pity, as I tell my students, doesn't just mean feeling sorry for somebody else. It means recognizing that but for the grace of God, that could be me. That's what pity is. And once again, that's such a deep concept that deserves prayer and reflection and research. And you know, the line that recurs in every three of the Lord of the Rings books is the pity of Bilbo may rule the fate of many.
Yeah.
Right, and it's true. If Bilbo had killed Gollum, Gollum wouldn't have been at the cracks of doom with Frodo, and the quest would not have been fulfilled because Frodo failed.
Yeah.
Right, and so these are some of the ideas that my research and my writing and my geekiness and my teaching tries to get across to the kids. And nowhere in Rings of Power do I see anything even approaching that.
I almost think that it's like a less graphic, less horrific Game of Thrones. Yeah. It's kind of what it feels like a little bit.
Yeah, I think they're modeling themselves more on Game of Thrones than they are on Tolkien. I agree with that. That's the first time we've agreed.
yeah, right. Because there's this like if you think about it, they're really trying to rule Middle Earth, right? It's like evil, like. Okay, so the other thing that I didn't like about the show, but I ended up kind of liking in the second season, was this character of Addar. I was so mad about him. I was like, this is a stupid character. He's not in the series at all. I went and looked up through books and was like, who is this person?
Yeah, who is he?
And the reason I didn't like him is because it makes this weird imbalance of the orcs are not following him or following Sauron. They hate Sauron. They kill Sauron at the beginning, and it's all this weird. And I'm like, how are they gonna get Sauron? He's the king of the orcs. How are they gonna get to that point? But the one thing I did like in the second season, I think overall the second season was just a better version, better at production than the first one. But again, I think it's because they kind of pulled maybe just a little bit more on love. The one thing I liked about his character is, even though he was wrong, he saw the humanity in these orcs that are evil, which I think, again, we don't have in Tolkien's world that doesn't make any sense. But I think in our humanity and the kind of time period that we live in, it almost seems like we can think of we have problems of the unborn or the elderly or anyone that's not useful. We kind of have this lack of humanity for them, right? Mm-hmm. And so I think the one thing I liked about that character as a Christian was saying yeah, these orcs are kind of awful, but at least he sees that they have some kind of humanity that is worth knowing.
Mm-hmm.
They're worth knowing and being seen.
I mean, you say humanity as a philosophical concept, but they have no humanity from their creation, because they were elves. They were elves who were ruined by Morgoth, Sauron's boss.
Oh, wait, hold on. So wait, is that the orcs though, or the Uruks? Because they make a difference in the show, and I don't know if that's
different.
True.
So the Uruks were bred by Saruman.
Yeah.
In the Lord of the Rings, right? Yeah,
right.
And the orcs are originally elves that were captured by Sauron's boss, Morgoth, who is kicked out of the physical plane at the end of the First Age in the Silmarillion and corrupted. So one thing, this is why I don't agree with what you just said. So I don't agree because, once again, consistent with Catholic Christian theology, the fall of the angels is irrevocable. Okay. Right?
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And the, once again, it's very complicated. You got to come take my class for a whole semester to understand all the background of this. But the angelic powers who were who are only spiritual beings are allowed to take physical form and descend into the created world, and they become what's called a Valar.
Right.
Morgoth or Melkor, his name is Melkor, is one of those, and he turns, he turns, and he falls, and that's how he becomes Morgoth. Morgoth means dark enemy, and he takes a bunch, just like Catholic theological tradition, he takes a bunch of other angelic powers with him. The Valar are the highest and the most powerful. The Maiar are the next. Gandalf is a Maiar, and Sauron is a Maiar. The Balrogs are Maiars. But that it's really important in Tolkien that turn, that fall, is irrevocable. They cannot be forgiven. And once again, this is a whole different topic, but there are some exorcists who are not now, but they have been saying for a while that it might be possible to convert the demons that they're casting out of people. And that's not my experience. And it's not the teaching of the church either.
Yeah.
So Sauron, the only reason that Sauron would would act as though he's loving is to lie.
Yeah.
And to manipulate.
And that kind of brings me to another point. I have two things I want to say, but we'll start with that one because that makes sense. But I had talked to you and I said one of the things that I think that they did well is maybe not show the good, but actually show the evil. Because one of the things I think that Sauron does well is he's the deceiver. Mm-hmm. Sometimes stupidly, like with the second season. I'm like, how could you fall for that?
Yeah.
Like, literally, how could you fall for that? He turns into a different person. Yeah. Like, something's up.
Suddenly he grows a blonde, long hair and gets pointy ears as an elf when he's Anatar. And I don't agree with that either, because I see the portrayal of Sauron in the second season of Rings of Power as somebody who's struggling with having the hots for Galadriel.
Well,
and also struggling with, as he kills Celebrimbor, he's crying.
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
In the appendices, Sauron uses the body of the elf who made the rings. He mounts it on a pole and uses it as his battle standard to tell all the elves that this is what happens when you mess with Sauron. It's exactly the same thing that the Jews were supposed to see when they saw a crucified person. Yeah. This is what happens when you mess with this power.
So, right? Sorry, going back to the show just a little bit. But isn't the point, you said the thing with Galadriel, but doesn't he do the same thing with one of Celebrimbor's, ladies that works in one of the smiths? I'm almost wondering if that's not him really caring, but him just showing them, making them feel
I don't disagree with that, and the show does say that, but where's the turn in the show to show that Sauron is absolutely unrepentant?
Actually, that's true. Yeah,
I saw that in the last scene of the first season, where Sauron is walking into Mordor, and I'm like, okay, I get it. I didn't see it anywhere in the second season, because I saw him struggling always with, especially with Galadriel, which makes absolutely no sense at all, because and this is canon. The three rings that were made for the elves are never touched by Sauron,
right,
in canon, right? And that's why Lothlorien can exist, that's why Rivendell can exist, and that's why when the ring is destroyed, those things begin to fade. But,
Okay, so I have a question then in terms of canon. When we talk about, in this episode, or in the season, you have him, trick Celebrimbor, and then he has access to the ring. So in the actual, canon of Tolkien, how does that happen? How does he get access to mess with the rings?
So Tolkien doesn't he never goes into a lot of deep psychological motivations about why people do things, right? What he says is that Sauron deceived Celebrimbor, and so under Sauron's deceit and guidance, Celebrimbor makes the 9 and the 7, but Celebrimbor had made the 3 beforehand, and without Sauron's influence and interference and seduction, really. So he doesn't say really how he does it, but he does say. Tolkien does say that Sauron appeared as this other person called Anatar, which is giver of gifts, and so that's canon. That is canon.
So let's go through. I know this is we probably should have started here, but we'll just do it really quick. I know that you dislike the show, but of the things in season 1 and season 2, what things are actually true, and then maybe how did they spin them to not be true, or whatever?
So one of the things that I can't say I liked it, but at least it's canon, is that it takes everybody a while to figure out who Sauron is. And that's canon. It takes everybody a while. And that even kind of extends itself into The Hobbit. Where by that time Sauron has reoccupied a place in southern Mirkwood called Dol Guldur, and the White Council, which is Saruman and Gandalf and Galadriel and Elrond and some of the most powerful in Middle Earth, they go and they kick him out, and that's when he goes back to Mordor. So it does take, just like it takes us in our spiritual life, discernment of spirits to figure out what the lies of the deceiver are. It takes those characters a while. So that's really kind of the biggest kind of narrative direction that to me is canon, right? Okay. And anything underneath that is just crazy. Another character that just absolutely irks me because it's not is Gandalf.
Yeah, and
He's Gandalf.
also Bombadil.
And Bombadil is in the wrong place. And,
I love Bombadil. I love him from the books, and so
and
like
the Hobbits,
yeah.
and they can't even call them Hobbits because they didn't have the right to call them Hobbits. They have to call them Harfoots, right?
Yeah.
And Harfoots are one of 3 tribes of Hobbits. Falahides, Harfoots, and Stoors that Tolkien talks about. Actually, in the preface to The Lord of the Rings, he talks about those 3 kind of tribes. And they have, some physical distinctions. One group is taller than the other, and one group has hairier feet than the other, and stuff like that. So, but why do we need, because Hobbits never show up.
Yeah.
In the first age or the second age, right?
Yeah.
Only in the third age. And mostly because Gandalf discovers the strength that the little people have, which is an internal strength, not an external, strength. They're not the biggest muscly bound, Boromir's fighters. They're the ones who are faithful, and once they start something, they're not going to stop. And, until
I
it's
love
done.
that in the Hobbit when he says something like Bilbo won't show his worth yet or whatever, and then as that unfolds.
Well, the last chapter of the Silmarillion, which is just a kind of a recap and a connection of the first and the second age to the third age in the story of the rings. Tolkien has one of the most beautiful things. He says, at the moment of greatest need, when the hands of the strong faltered, the weak had to take it up. Yeah. And that is Christian. That's Anawim. That's that's who we are. And Rings of Power will never get there. It'll never get there.
Yeah. And I think that one of the things with, like, as we keep talking, it's so true, again, where I was thinking earlier about how it's just really entertaining. And I mean, like, sure, the fight scenes are good or whatever, but I mean, that's not even what I'm thinking about. There's just so many stories, again, kind of like what we talked about Game of Thrones, that it's just like, oh, entertaining, like in that way. But as we have our conversation here, I think you're right in that, they're just kind of floating. Mm-hmm. It's like,
well,
where is
and
this
the other thing
go?
is the time compression of the show, right?
Yeah.
I mean, it's just nuts. It's completely crazy. I mean, one of the things that is important for Tolkien mythologically is time, because of the immortality of the elves and what that means, and the mortality of humans, right, and what that means. And that's a whole theological thing. It takes me all semester. In fact, I'm just there now with my students, and we're almost at the end of November, and I've got 2.5 weeks of class left after Thanksgiving to kind of wrap all this stuff up with my kids. But it's important that for Tolkien, the immortality of the elves is deceptively desirable, but for them it's not. They call their immortality the long defeat. Yeah. And there's a mythological spirituality of where their souls go. An elf soul goes where it dies, and it's tied to the physical world. For humans, it's completely different. In fact, there's a dialogue, almost like a platonic dialogue, between an elf and an elderly human woman talking about this stuff that I'm going to have the kids read after Thanksgiving.
Is that in the Silmarillion?
No, it's in one of the Histories of Middle-earth books. It's called the dialogue between Finrod and Andreth, and it's about mortality. And what it amazingly does is it establishes the idea that for humans, to die is a gift, because to die is to be free of the travails of this world. Yeah. And the elves will never know that. And the belief of the elves, who can't experience a human mortality, the belief of the elves is that God, who's Eru, he's named as Eru Iluvatar in Tolkien's mythology, but that God himself takes the human souls to himself, which is absolutely consistent with Catholic theology. And also, they talk about how do you fix everything that's been broken in this world? And in this dialogue, they say, okay, only God can fix it. We can't fix it. And in order to fix it, he has to become part of it.
So,
I mean, it is absolutely setting the stage for the incarnation. Yeah. And Tolkien said in one of his famous essays called On Fairy Stories that the God of Middle-earth is the God of Judeo-Christian. Yeah. I mean, Eru Iluvatar will eventually become Yahweh to the people of Israel, and will eventually become Abba to Christians.
Do you think that if he was had lived longer, that he would have gotten to the point in his trilogy or in his stories to bring? You said Avatar, or how do you say
Iluvatar.
Iluvatar. Sorry, to bring Iluvatar and have that kind of dialogue or have a stronger connection to that?
Maybe. I mean, one of the things we know he was suspicious of, and this was a kind of a fun academic debate between he and his good friend C.S. Lewis, but he didn't like allegory. And he didn't like the fact that the reader or the experiencer of allegory can only interpret it one way.
Yeah.
Right? The biggest example is in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. There's only one Christ figure. You can't say that about the Lord of the Rings. I mean, traditional interpretation of the Lord of the Rings is that Aragorn, Gandalf, and Frodo represent priest, prophet, and king, right? Yeah. And but Aslan is the only Christ figure in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And I mean, that's unfair to Lewis to just say that part, because you have to say the other part, which is Lewis was one of the world's foremost experts on allegory, and used contemporary allegory as a way of revising ancient allegory, which was to teach the truths of the faith to people who couldn't read.
That's one of my favorite books from him, because I thought it was just so, and maybe it's because I could understand it really well, was The Great Divorce.
I love The Great Divorce.
I mean, that is one of the best allegoric works, because it's like, it's such a good story, and I think it does a great job of to describe heaven and hell and purgatory.
Yeah. I mean, have you read all of the Narnia books?
I've read all of the Narnia books, and the last one is also very good.
The last
right when he's going through the barn, right?
The last one is amazing, and one of the things that's amazing about it is the kids all die.
Yeah,
they all die except for Susan. They all die.
Yeah,
right. And Reepicheep leads them up the mountain, and he keeps saying it just gets better. Yeah. It just keeps getting better.
But it kind of ties in, right? So Reepicheep goes in through, and he's saying it's getting better. But also, if you read The Great Divorce, it's so much like that. It's like almost the same story. Like you could see how his mythology is actually coming into this story, The Great Divorce, to describe that. Yeah.
Absolutely. And Tolkien said he disliked allegory because the author manipulates the reader. So C.S. Lewis had to decide that Aslan was going to be the Christ figure before the reader experiences Aslan as the Christ figure.
Right.
And Tolkien said that he didn't use mythology. He used the word history. And he said either real or made up, because that is the responsibility of the reader of history to make the meaning for his or her own life.
And when I was going through the Tolkien books, one of the things I would say is, I'm like, it's so obvious that this is like the 12 apostles and Christ, like when you're watching them go through the fellowship and you're seeing like their struggles and everything. But it wasn't until I watched like a Pints of Aquinas podcast they had on the trilogy or something or Tolkien, and I was like hearing things, I'm like, oh, that makes a lot of sense. But I think you're right when he was saying this, is like it can be interpreted so many different ways, which I think is more intellectually like it's more challenging. But it's not,
because it means you don't have to be a Christian in order to be. I mean, you don't have to interpret it from a Christian perspective.
That's true.
That's the other thing, and we do this in my class, is that Tolkien was influenced certainly by his Catholic faith, but he was also influenced by the literature of the pagan North. Tales like Beowulf and the Olaf sagas, and the Heimskringla, and the Snorri Sturluson books and stuff like that, which is pagan. And the ultimate value in that kind of literature is, even if you're engaged in something that is doomed to failure, you don't give up.
Yeah,
you don't give up, right? And so these things in Tolkien, in canon, and in the literature and in the mythology, weave together in such a beautiful way, where you have to pull out. If you're going to see it in a Christian, you have to pull that out.
Yeah,
it doesn't just hit you in the face. But from Lewis, I mean, to defend Lewis is writing allegorical Christianity for the purpose of encountering an atheistic world.
Which
right.
I really love.
They're different purposes, and I love it. And I love the fact that Tolkien and Lewis had this. I mean, it didn't ruin their friendship.
No,
they just had this academic disagreement about what the purpose was. And
I think so. Now that we've like kind of talked about that, it's so obvious in the Rings of Power that it lacks any of that. Yeah. And so when I initially was like, oh, I thought the writing was fine, and you were like, no, the writing's awful.
It's terrible.
I think when we're actually approaching it from like a not liturgical, a literary point of view, I guess like I'm easily convinced, obviously, but I think it is. I think.
Well, my brother, so he's not as much of a Tolkien fan, but I mean, I'm the oldest of three children, and all three of us have kind of literary sensibilities. My brother's a writer, and he tries to write movies, and of course nobody buys them and stuff. And I mean, my feeling about my poor brother is he's incredibly creative and incredibly talented, and people aren't going to discover that until he dies in poverty. Right.
But he tells me, if you don't like Rings of Power, you shouldn't support it by watching it. But I can't not watch it. I can't not watch it. I got to know what the culture is saying about Tolkien, and then I can get, I'm not as angry as some of the people on YouTube are about. I mean, they're just vitriolic about it. But at the same time, I think it's a mistaken opportunity. Really, I mean, look at the shirt I wear. I mean, it's a mistaken opportunity to evangelize the culture.
Yeah.
Which is part of what Jackson can be seen as having done. And he said in an interview, we didn't want to put our own stuff in. We wanted to just put Tolkien in the movie, right? Now, that he wasn't 100% successful, but he was more successful than anybody else has been.
I think the one thing that I disliked about the movies, again, this is kind of trailing back into the trilogy, but the one thing I disliked about the movies is in the books, the world of men, once they were tuned into the mission, they were gung-ho and they were all in, and there was no, think of Rohan, the
King Theoden.
Yeah, King Theoden. When he is broken, the spell is broken on him, he's like, let's go. We're out of here. We're fighting, And in the movies, that was one of my biggest disappointments, is I feel like they really failed man. And just because, and I don't know if maybe I was just being overly sensitive of this culture where people are like, oh, we're all trash, and we don't humanity is we're just this scum and we need to atone for all of our stuff.
That's the other thing in canon is you got to go back thousands of years to the First Age to find out why elves and humans might not get along, to find out why Boromir doesn't want to go to Lothlorien. And I mean, there's a whole story behind that comes out of the Silmarillion. There's a whole story that comes out of the Silmarillion, which makes the friendship of Legolas and Gimli all the more sacred and holy because it's so freaking rare in Middle Earth.
Okay, so that's another question. Let's go back to the Rings of Power. It's they have, you have the elf, Elrond, and gosh, my names today are just off. Durin, yeah. So, and how their friendship is that canonical?
No, it's not canonical. And I mean,
do you think they were playing on that relationship?
I think that they were playing on the fact that Elrond was such a popular character in Jackson's movies, and they were trying to figure out what his growth into that person would have been like. I'm going to say something and then I'm going to take it away. Okay. The thing that is the least awful to me about Rings of Power is the portrayal of dwarf culture. That's the thing that, and I don't like it, but it's the least offensive to me. However, they get some major things wrong in it. One of the things they get wrong is that the dwarves believed that the kings were kind of partial reincarnations of their first king, who was named Durin. There is never two Durins in one place.
Oh, okay.
At the same time.
Yeah.
And
so
there is
Durin and Durin's son.
Durin and Durin. It's yeah. So it's
and Durin, because he has a brother that you hear about. Yeah. Kind of. So.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And Durin's Bane, I mean, that's the other thing that's partially canonical, is the father who dies at the hands of the Balrog in season 2. There's indication that may have happened, but not how that happened. And they call the Balrog Durin's Bane, right?
Yeah, because that goes into the story, the little song, right, in the trilogy as well. So, I don't think, as you said, I don't think I'm thinking back, and I don't think I was ever offended with the dwarves. There wasn't any woke anything or anything that was.
I think that Jackson mistook the dwarves for comic relief in some ways. I mean, Gimli, falling off his horse or having a drinking contest with Legolas and stuff like that.
Yeah.
I mean, he just didn't know what to do with the dwarves. And the dwarves have their own culture, their own story. They have a very distinct story of their creation. I mean, and that is the reason why they are short and why they like what they like and all that stuff. There's a philosophical idea called etiology, and etiology is the study of the beginnings of things. How things began. So why do bad things happen to good people? There's a story about that, right? And Genesis helps us understand what that is. There's something in us that will resist God. Right, and you just can't get away from it, and we name that original sin. You can't get away from it; it's part of our humanity, right? But etiology can also be, why are eagles noble? you know, or
Yeah,
why
yeah.
do elves and dwarves not get along with one another?
Mhm.
You know, and so the Silmarillion is the etiology that undergirds the Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings. You know, very different kinds of books. And as you said, the Silmarillion is a chronicle. It's not one story. It's all sorts of different stories, but all serving that purpose of etiological kind of reflection that undergirds the Lord of the Rings and the Hobbit.
When I think of the Rings of Power, I actually think that I can see a similarity in the dwarves to the dwarves in the Hobbit.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I don't think that they're super far away of how they're portrayed.
Mm-hmm. I could go there. I could go there. Yeah.
When we go to Numenor, there's the queen, and she's eaten by, she's not eaten by the snake. And so I want to know,
that's not canonical. There's nothing in Tolkien that trial by sea monster. There's nothing there.
I have to say that's pretty cool though. Like, if it wasn't canonical, like, I feel like that was pretty cool.
You know,
so wait, is the eagle also, is that canonical, where the eagle would come and like verify the kingship or whatever?
Not exactly. I mean, it's a more complicated answer than that. But let me talk about Numenor for just a second. So Numenor is an island in the middle of the sea that is given to the humans who, in the first age, fight with the elves against Morgoth. There's a whole thing about longevity. So the west is the direction of not of heaven so much, but of the realm of the Valar on Earth. And in the first age, you can actually sail there. In the first and the second age, you can sail there. By the end of the third age, you can't. By the beginning of the third age, you can't sail there anymore.
Is it because it's destroyed?
It's destroyed.
They suggest.
And Numenor is destroyed in a wave because it's in the middle of the sea, and it's Tolkien's take on Atlantis. In fact, and one of the dialects of languages that he developed, he calls Numenor Atalante.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So, so it's clear. It's really clear, kind of what's influencing him. The other thing you need to know about Tolkien is Tolkien had a nightmare over the course of his life about being swallowed by a wave, and
he didn't even live on the sea, did he?
No, he didn't. Yeah, but it's interesting, and he also was bitten by a spider when he was a baby in South Africa before he moved. So yeah,
the spiders.
Biographical information sometimes can be helpful, but. Numenor is corrupted, and once again, Sauron helps that corruption. Numenor is corrupted over the course of thousands of years, and so, and many kings, and many, and a few queens in there too, but many kings. And what you see in the Rings of Power is the end point of that journey. So you see Numenor at the time of its greatest corruption, and you see characters like. Isildur's father. I'm drawing a blank on his name. I should. Yeah. But
Erwin? No, that's his sister. Erwin's.
Yeah, and she's not she's not canonical either. So.
Oh my gosh, this is gonna drive me nuts. As soon as we get off the camera, it's gonna come up.
As soon as we get off camera, and
I'll just pop it up on the screen.
Yeah. But you see him as the leader of the faithful, right? And so what will happen is when Numenor is destroyed. The faithful are on the east shore of Numenor, and the wave actually pushes them back to Middle-earth. And they actually become the Dunedain, of which Aragorn is the last kind of survivor of. And so the reason they live so long is because they live on this island that's in the middle of the sea that's halfway toward the angelic realm on Earth. So
wait, so their lifespans are longer?
Yeah, their lifespans are longer. Yeah, their lifespans are longer.
Okay, so another question that goes back into the books, though, is like the people that... Aragorn goes and gets that are trapped in the mountain. Are those the Numenorians? Is that what you're saying?
So that's the army of the dead, and they had told a previous king. So once again, we're in the weeds now. So
I just didn't know if they were connected.
Yeah, they are connected. They are, but they're connected in a specific way. So the Numenorians found two kingdoms in Middle Earth: the kingdom of Arnor in the north, and the kingdom of Gondor in the south. When Aragorn asks to marry Arwen, her father Elrond sets for Aragorn a task that he doesn't believe he can, because dads don't want to give their daughters away, right? Especially immortal dads don't want to give their daughters away to mortals, right? And this is reflective of the first age story, which is absolutely the centerpiece of the Silmarillion, called the story of Beren and Luthien. Which is we can do a whole podcast on that one, but Aragorn does. He reunites the kingdoms of Gondor and Arnor. Arnor has been destroyed and taken over by the Witch King.
Oh, okay.
And Gondor is in a place of decline as well because there's been no king, and it's the steward. Denethor is the steward, and the reason that Elrond actually gives Arwen to Aragorn in the movies, in that beautiful scene at the end, is because he's done that. He's become the king of the reunited kingdom, and so the Númenóreans are the most royal of the humans because way back in the first age, they fought with the elves against Morgoth, and they were faithful.
Yeah.
But many of them lost their fidelity to, they're called the elf friends. They lost their fidelity to the elves over the course of the Second Age because of Sauron's influence on them.
Yeah.
And some remained faithful.
I think that's really interesting about Sauron is he's so sneaky in that he touches everybody. Yeah. He touches, like, he gets in with the elves, he gets in, does he ever, the only people that I don't think he does touch very much besides getting rings to them is the dwarves? Is that true?
It is true, but it's part, and that's not canonical. I mean, Durin's obsession with his ring is not canonical,
sure.
Right?
Yeah.
But, I mean, the dwarves are interested in other things. They're interested in how deep they can go, not how many people they can rule, how many other people. They kind of keep to themselves, and there's a reason for that. Once again, there's an etiological reason for that, going all the way back to their creation in the First Age, right? Yeah. So
he's kind of sneaky like that. He's getting into everybody's business.
And you're right. Sauron is getting into everybody's business, not unlike Satan.
Yeah, absolutely.
Who looks for a doorway to tell you a partial truth, or to twist a truth so that you'll believe a lie.
Be a deceiver. Yeah. Okay, so my last question that we'll kind of end on this, and it partly is through the Numenor. You said that the Numenor was halfway towards the Valar. Or anyways, my question, because we kind of talked about this a little bit earlier, but there's a part in the second movie or the second season where when Celebrimbor dies, he says, "I'm going to go to the Valar and they'll reincarnate me if they think that I should be," or whatever. Is that true? And then also, can you kind of talk about the Valar, like how I was kind of thinking about it through this last season? I was looking up some texts and stuff trying to figure out what it is, because it seems like it is like an angelic sphere, right? And you'd mentioned that, but this is just my understanding from reading. It's like it's an angelic place where it's kind of like heaven almost, but it's just like this place where the angels reside.
So I mean, it's not like heaven. It's more like the Arthurian Avalon. I don't know if you know what Avalon is, but Avalon is where Arthur goes after he dies to await to be kind of called back.
Okay.
So the elves can reincarnate. So they go to, the Valar were the angelic spirits who were allowed to descend into the physical realm and take on physical form. Right, but the gods' limits on that was that they are now tied with the physical world, and they descended into the physical world because they wanted to help God's creative image come to be.
Yeah,
and they're. I mean, Tolkien has a whole other philosophical kind of wing of this called the difference between creation and subcreation. Nobody creates from nothing except God.
Yeah.
Everybody else subcreates. So we take what God has given to us and we beautify it by arranging it in different fashions. Yeah. That's what he's doing with his mythology. So one of the Vala's name is Mandos, and he keeps the halls of the dead. And so the souls of the elves, if they die in Middle Earth, they go to the halls of Mandos, and they can become reincarnated and come back into the world if they want to. But once the world ends, so in the Second Coming, Armageddon, Maranatha, whatever it is, they will be done.
Okay.
Their souls will no longer exist. Just like their bodies. The elves will not exist anymore.
So they won't be called. They won't be called to the God, like to God then.
Yeah. Yes, that they won't be called to God. There is a possible exception to that.
Okay.
but yes, for the most part, they won't be called to God. And so in the First and the Second Age, you could sail to where the Valar lived. It's called Valinor.
Yeah.
And the gift of Numenor to men in the Second Age came with a restriction. It was halfway between the seas, so it was physically closer to Valinor than Middle-earth was. That's why their life became longer. But they were forbidden to sail west so far that they could no longer see the shores of Numenor. And over the course of thousands of years, their corruption leads the last king. It's Ar-Pharazôn, the guy with the big white beard in the Rings of Power, to get in his ships and go to Valinor to try to take immortality from the Valar.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, that's.
I hate him.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, I don't know if he's like, do you think that they did a good job in depicting him? Because I really don't like him.
I don't like him either, but I don't like the way he acts. I don't like
him at all.
I mean, I don't like the character. I don't like the
or the son.
character.
His son.
Yeah.
His son is he's.
Yeah.
Okay, so then going in to finish up.
Yeah.
To tie
your last question.
My last question. So when we have at the end, you have Frodo and who was it? Frodo and I think Sam was also invited. But anyways, they were invited to go to Valinor. Mm-hmm. But wouldn't that be worse than being assumed into like God's presence?
Not necessarily. I mean, they'll go to Valinor to heal their hurts, but they'll still die.
Okay, so is Valinor like? Could we assume it's like kind of like a purgatory for mortal beings? Maybe.
I don't know. I once again that seems to like cross the line into allegory a little too much for me, for my interpretive kind of beliefs. But yeah, the closest thing that I've seen in other literature to Valinor is the concept of Avalon, where Arthur goes to kind of be healed of his hurts and then be called back to England when England needs him. But of course, I mean, the Arthurian stories are a hodgepodge of different things in a way that Tolkien's not.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Do you have any recommendations for anyone that has liked the narrative or like likes the trilogy or, well, I guess let me start here. So if you were to suggest any books based off of the Rings of Power, what books would you recommend? If you have someone like myself, this is kind of a selfish question, but I really like the mythological kind of story. So I like Narnia, like that kind of stuff. I also really like the Lord of the Rings. Yeah. I like kind of these like hero stories. Yeah. What would be a good recommendation or good authors to follow?
So the corrective to the Rings of Power to me is to read the source material.
Yeah.
Right, to read The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And if you have the opportunity to be in a book club of the Silmarillion with somebody who knows what they're talking about. In terms of interpreting Tolkien, there are two books that I would recommend as you asked that question. One is a book by Ralph Wood called The Gospel According to Tolkien.
Oh!
It's a beautiful, beautiful book that will go directly into kind of a Catholic theological interpretation of Tolkien. The other is a newer book published by Word on Fire Press by Holly Ordway, which is a biography of Tolkien, but only focusing on his Catholic faith.
Wow.
His mother was a convert. His mother converted, and she's done a great job, a very scholarly job, in writing a Catholic biography of Tolkien.
Those look amazing. Yeah. I'm excited.
I think it's called Tolkien's Faith. I think that's the title of Ordway's book. But Ralph Wood, Gospel According to Tolkien, and Holly Ordway, Tolkien's Catholic Faith, I think it's called.
And I'll link those down in the description as well. But any other suggestions of like maybe not Tolkien writings, but good mythological?
So I think as Tolkien's work became popular in the 50s, Lord of the Rings was published in 1957. As those works became popular, everybody tried to get in on the bandwagon, right? And so, I mean, I've loved different things. So I've loved the Sword of Shannara series, Terry Brooks. It's stupid. The first one is an absolutely shameless copy of Tolkien, but I loved it when I encountered it.
Which one is that again?
The Sword of Shannara.
Okay, because I think they made a they made a TV show off of it or something, and I liked the TV show. But
one of the ones that I really like is by an Oregon author, Ursula Le Guin, called The Wizard of Earthsea, and that is that's kind of Harry Potter before Harry Potter was popular or was even thought of. But and that's very short, and it's a trilogy.
Okay.
And then the other one is Mary Stewart's. I think it's a 4-book series about Arthur.
Okay.
The Crystal Cave, the Hollow Hills, the Last Enchantment, and the Wicked Day, I think. And it's from Merlin's perspective, and it's really good, really, really well done.
I wonder if the Merlin series is based off those books.
Good question. Good question. Yeah. There was one series that I enjoyed. It's really, really, really dark. It's called the Thomas Covenant series, Stephen R. Donaldson, and it's about a guy who has leprosy in this world, but when he goes to the other world, he doesn't believe it's real. He believes it's a figment of his imagination to deal with his sickness and with his and he does some horrible things. But I was very entertained. I'm not sure if I would recommend that or not. Yeah, I mean the Game of Thrones books are good, but they're not finished.
Yeah.
You know, they're not. I don't think he'll ever finish because the series finished in a terrible way.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That could be a whole nother podcast.
Yeah, it could be
just
a whole
on
other
how
podcast.
it ended.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
There was so much better fan fiction, endings than
yeah.
there was with the actual show.
Absolutely.
Anyways, well, I know that we're running out of time, so I will thank you so much, Father Vance, for coming on.
Absolutely. Yeah.
It was a pleasure.
Clearly, I love talking about this stuff. So
maybe we'll have you come on again. We can talk about some other literature.
Yeah,
That'd be great.
That would be fun. God bless.
Thanks. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of Desert Wanderers. If you liked it, give us a thumbs up as well as subscribe down below. We're produced by Salt and Light Radio, so you can find us on social platforms at Salt and Light Radio or Desert Wanderers Podcast. We produce episodes every week and we launch them for you on Wednesdays, so make sure to tune in for next week's episode and we'll see you then.